Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. Today I am joined by the most esteemed Lord Ainsworth to discuss the topic of Normie, specifically the other dimensionality of the Normie. But before launching into that, I think we should get our definitions clear because I've noticed in recent years, perhaps in recent months, some people use the term Normie in the context of looks to refer to an average-looking person, whereas I would use the term exclusively to refer to people's mental architecture, their neurotypical natures, them just being normal folk who are not deviant in any way, who conform to expectations, normal expectations. So that would be my definition. And throughout this talk, that would be my assumption about what exactly a normie is. But I'm curious to get Lord Ainsworth's input on this as well.
Yeah, my definition of normie is more or less the same. Um, Framing normie or using normie as a term to describe, an average person's looks, like you said, very prevalent now, much more prevalent than the old usage. It's illustrative. It's characteristic of the general trajectory that neologisms like this take. When
Yeah.
a new term first comes around, it's pretty specific, it means something pretty specific, and then more and more people use it and apply it more broadly and generally to things beyond what it was originally meant for. And we've definitely seen that in this case. I would agree. My definition of normie, for the most part, as I use it, is just an individual whose beliefs, ideology, thoughts, tendencies, personality, inclinations, you name it, is standard, is acceptable, socially acceptable. It follows a general trend um, that follows the general trend that most people believe. That's my definition, same as yours, basically.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point to make with neologisms in general, or just terms, words. Words change meaning over time, and this is no different, especially in today's fast-paced internet world. Just use the term red-pilled. I honestly have no idea what red-pilled means until a particular speaker tells me what he means by red-pilled, and even black-pilled. So, for example, again, the people who talk about normies in sort of lookism communities, if you wish to call them such, when they talk about black pill, they're really just focusing on looks. They're not focusing on the entirety of the misery of human existence as we might be more inclined to. So they're really just focusing on being black pilled about your chances of getting X with a girl if you're a sub 5 or whatever. So
And that actually does closely mirror the first known prominent instance I know of the usage of the phrase of the term. I mean, these are all silly terms and phrases we use to
goofy is
describe
your favorite
our.
word, yeah.
Yeah, these are all goofy terms that we use to describe some of the things we think or believe or think about. I mean, I use them. They're pretty goofy, but that, like I said, that does more so mirror the first big prominent instance of the phrase black pill that I'm familiar with, which is Eggman. It was this basically proto-incel before the term incel was widespread in the mid 2010s. Just somebody who's very unlucky in terms of looks, massive forehead, that sort of thing. He made this video in his car rambling about the black pill, and it was largely about looks. It was large. It really does mirror the tendency of the discourse that we see today in these sorts of communities.
That's interesting.
It's very reminiscent. It's very reminiscent.
For me, my first encounter with it was in talking to sort of reactionary politics folk and what have you. They would describe sort of X situation as, and say, well, they're pretty black-pilled on X situation. So interesting, because I observed an alternative. But I mean, obviously, nobody has a monopoly on the use of these terms.
Yeah,
Uh,
of course.
but generally, yeah,
When would you say that you were? I mean, this is an aside. We'll get back to the main topic in a moment. But
mm,
when did you tend to see these, people using the term referring to reactionary politics or being discouraged about things like that.
State of the
When did you
world.
see? Yeah, when did you see that
Uh,
generally happen?
Starting about 5 years ago, I'd say. Yeah, maybe 5 years ago, people saying, I don't know, I'm just making an example up. I had the situation with marriage and divorce is pretty blackpilling, and people saying things like that rather than it exclusively being applied to looks. And for me, I don't know why. Maybe it's my age. I just prefer to refer to sort of overarching tendencies as either black-pilled or I would describe sort of normies rather than saying, well, you're a normie if you're a 5.2 in looks or whatever. I mean, sure, I guess you are, but maybe it's my age. So yeah, I would say about 5 to 6 years ago was the first instance where I heard of political discontents basically saying, yeah, I'm pretty black-pilled on X or what, take your pick of the topic.
Yeah, I was exposed to both types of people and both types of definitions. They seem to have emerged and grown coterminously alongside each other. Um, I was around both of those types of people at the time, so I saw both of those spring up. So it's really hard to figure out what the origin is. Not that it matters, but
No,
it's a semi-interesting little aside. But like I said, my definition very much, as I use it in conversation, is describing mentality and personality more so than anything to do with dating, sexual marketplace stuff and
yeah.
looks. It's much more about mentality for me.
Yeah, for me as well. And maybe I can start this off with an anecdote of a somewhat interesting normie encounter I had fairly recently. And I don't really, with most people, talk about my fairly elaborate views on, I guess you could say, sociobiology or men and women. And I always make it a point that I'm not very committed on many positions I hold simply because I lack the intelligence and the information to be committed about very much of anything. So I don't have a strong position on climate change because I'm not a climatologist. I just don't know. I don't have a strong position on the events going on in Eastern Europe because I'm not a historian or a political scientist, that sort of thing. There are a few things, though, I will commit to, although not to the point where I would simply not change my view. One of them is general trends and behavior in men and women, and I'm pretty committed to what I think is an accurate view of these things. That said, I think I told you this the other day, if for some reason research were to come out over the next decade or so repeatedly mentioning how women want to be resource providers and want men to stay home to take care of children, and this was a global, uh, observable across multiple cultures phenomenon, then well, I guess I changed my mind. But that said, I was in a situation where I initially was dismissed as a kind of idiot for holding my quote-unquote views of women, and by a normie, by the way. And this particular normie is a fairly smart guy. I mean, there's no denying he's a very smart guy. Works in a field that requires a lot of intelligence, but normie nonetheless in terms of his mentality. And I told him, I said, look, I'll concede that just in terms of raw intelligence, you are much smarter than I am. But I don't think you've taken the time to look at the data and look at the things that I've looked at. Therefore, dismissing my position as idiotic or what have you doesn't seem particularly apt because you haven't looked at the data. And it's just back and forth for a while. And eventually he just said he doesn't care. But it turned out, and then before that he said, well, you're basically wrong, but I'm not going to tell you why you're wrong, which I thought was a very asinine thing to say. It turned out later that he used the excuse of calling me quote unquote depressed, and therefore everything I say and everything I think is colored by this quote unquote depressed view, and therefore it can't be right. And I've noticed this particularly with quote unquote smart normies, very smart normies, that anything that might be quote unquote black pilling or red pilling or just, I think these are goofy terms, but sort of run counter to their worldview. For example, that men and women might be different. And by the way, I was laying out very specific points, talking about generally what men want, generally what women want, because one of the points being contested was this idea that you can't approach the dating and mating market in terms of a strategic, in terms of strategy, or in terms of a strategic, tactical perspective. So I said, look, the first things first, you have a looks test, then it goes to personality, all these things. But mixed into all of that is that men and women, broadly speaking, want different things in partners, right? And I was laying out all these details. Women do have an interest in resources, particularly as they get older. The values change slightly. Men mostly use fertility. I said these key points can be used, perhaps to good effect, navigating the mating and dating market. And some people had offered their anecdotes or what have you, and I mean that always happens. But I'm not that interested in anecdotes, even though they can be illustrative. It was more about these are the general trends. But again, yeah, these guy, and I've met people like him, although not quite as dismissive as he was, simply saying, well, you're depressed and an idiot, and therefore nothing you say can be correct. Something that I I've only rarely encountered in that form, but I thought was very, very typical of a kind of normie mental architecture whereby there's a limit to what might be absorbed. In fact, he made it a point to say that he wasn't there to learn anything, as if he didn't need to learn anything. And I said, well, look, I'm not necessarily here to learn anything either, but sometimes you do learn things, and nobody knows everything. But there was a kind of, yeah, I'd have to say hubris and arrogance to the guy. And it's interesting because I used to think he and I were at least on friendly terms until this came to light, obviously. But that struck me as a very normie type of behavior to say, well, your view is colored by X, therefore you can discount everything you're saying. And obviously, this is a kind of protective measure because maybe the individual doesn't want to engage with the argument at all, which I don't think he did. But in general, that kind of perspective where you just say, look, you're depressed or there's something wrong with you, so why pay attention? Yeah. And it's in a way, it's not too dissimilar to the way a lot of people, normies, will dismiss sort of incel arguments, right? Well, you're just a loser who's never gotten laid. But at the same time, you should have a shower and go to the gym so you can get laid. And then somehow it's a bit confusing. I was curious what you think about that. You said you've encountered people like that before.
Yeah, we've both actually encountered someone like that before. I don't know if you recall. He was talking about how he was trying to advise some of his friends, trying to coach some of his friends in PUA tactics and that
Hmm.
sort of thing, and how he had gotten success and how he used to not really have much success with women, uh, with the sexual marketplace and all of that. But then he started getting success eventually, and then he was trying to, kind of push his friends into adopting, in his
Hmm.
view, the correct behavioral the correct approach, the correct methods. And he kind of had a bit of contempt for them because they, in his eyes, they weren't doing everything they could be doing. And he was very, very insistent on how all of his success was the result of his own effort and his
Oh,
own hard
yes.
work, his own perseverance. But then we found out that he was, I think at some point we saw a photo of him and he was probably a 7 out of 10 or something like that, or 7.5. I'm not entirely sure.
He
Um,
wasn't bad looking by any stretch, yeah.
right. He was probably above average.
Hmm.
And he was very reluctant to. He was intelligent enough to be working in some kind of STEM field, or he was going to university for STEM. And so obviously intelligent guy, right? And I was talking to him for a while. You were there. And I got him to acknowledge on an abstract verbal level that it's not necessarily the case that all of his success was the result of his own personal efforts and his own hard work and all of that. But even though he recognized that verbally because he just didn't have good arguments to the contrary, he couldn't present a convincing, compelling case for his point of view. He still expressed a very strong, feeling, a very strong sensation, attachment to that idea. Um,
And remember, he also said that he was basically going to dump his friends, that he was only friends with these guys because he was in a different spot and he sort of wanted to move past that. I recall the gentleman, a kangaroo eater, if I recall, yeah. Now, yeah, yeah. I mean, this was a kind of normie who wasn't a normie, sort of, because he was sort of boasting about sort of his red pill knowledge or whatever, but at the same time was acting in an extremely normie fashion. And
yeah, he was an interesting case. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you get this sometimes, but I think the point of this talk is, for me, is that there's a kind of other dimension I've noticed with normies broadly that I simply cannot enter. It really feels, and I've addressed this in videos,
The
that
way they perceive reality, the way
yeah,
they
yes,
interface, interact with information, all of that.
yeah, that they're actually inhabiting a different dimension. You kind of might be able to pass by, I'll call it a portal, this portal, and peer into it briefly, maybe, but it's completely alien, and they have no comprehension of things, I guess, on our end. And I mean, just to give an example, and I think this might be illustrative again of maybe, in fact, our views are colored by our associations. I think, of our friend group, I can think of, of all the people we know, one person who's doing reasonably well, right? Without going into details, everyone else has very, very poor to absolutely wretched, miserable circumstances, right? And
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and it's just I think about that, and I'm willing to concede. Well, yeah, if you know these types of people or you're friends with them, then that will color your worldview. But it can't be that the normie in his other dimension is simply unaware of the potential misery and vicissitudes of life that befall people that lead to those states of being. So I don't really know what planet they're operating in. Or if they are aware, they have, frankly, maybe a better means of compartmentalizing it. Because I share your view that when I look at the world, I see not that much that's particularly pleasant. And to that,
Pockets of pleasantness, but for the
yeah,
most part, yeah.
yeah, pockets of pleasantness. Overall, it's not a pretty picture. But to bring up the first example of the super smart normie guy, that's called you're quote unquote depressed. But I'm trying to see because I've talked to this guy or had talked to the guy before about some pretty traumatic experiences in his life, and it's I don't know. Maybe it's a matter of simply quote unquote not succumbing to a black pill view, despite being surrounded by events that could only precipitate a black pill view of the world. But I I don't really get people in this other dimension. I don't understand how they don't think the world is that way. And again, I'm biased. We all have our biases. Is it simply that they're not paying attention, or is it something else?
I mean, of course, and you would agree with this, I imagine. There's not going to be one single universal explanation for each and every single individual.
Yeah,
There are a variety of at least potential causes that probably apply to at least someone out there on this planet.
yeah,
Um, in the case of that guy you were talking to who was, very dismissive of the points that you were putting forth and everything you were saying about, male-female dynamics and all of that. In his case, it just seems to me that in his case, what it sounds like is simply maintaining the status quo when somebody encounters or normie, somebody like that, when somebody like that encounters some idea or argument or notion or concept that is socially unacceptable, right? Any acknowledgement of differences between men and women, anything like that, that's generally socially unacceptable if you express views like that and play. I mean, everybody knows. Everybody
Mm.
listening to this knows if you express those sorts of opinions and views in quote unquote polite company and respectable company, um, your invisible social credit score is going to be seriously damaged by that. And on some level or another, this guy is almost certainly conscious, is not conscious, but on some level, this guy is almost certainly aware of this, whether it's conscious or subconscious or something like that. So I think a lot of the complete lack of connection or the complete lack of recognition of realities or trends that exist outside of the general, normal worldview, I think a lot of it can be explained by simple maintaining of status quo. Just because if you even open up the possibility of you being convinced of, something like what you were talking about, male-female dynamics, differences between men and women, if you even open yourself up to a possibility like that of being convinced of that could be seriously, you know, you could just be saddled with a view or opinion or an idea that is socially unacceptable. If he seriously heard you out and actually evaluated what you were saying, your claims on their own merits and against the evidence, and he seriously considered it, what, and let's say he was convinced, what would be the outcome of that? He would now have a view of the world that he has to be careful about expressing to other people and will make it more difficult for him to fit in with groups of people and socially network and get along with people and have opportunities and all sorts of cascading knock-on effects downstream from that. Um, Basically, all the opportunities you're ever going to have in your life are a result of some sort of social network,
No.
right? That's just how it works. Jobs, interpersonal relations, before online dating and Tinder, you had the bar, you had the club, and then you had people you knew for, dating and casual sex opportunities. Those were basically your options. So I think a fairly large chunk of it can be simply explained by guarding against accepting ideas that could potentially make it more difficult for you to fit in with people and cohere and conform and reap the benefits of that conformity, because there are massive benefits, to the extent that I haven't conformed in my life, and it hasn't been a principled refusal to bend, to the will of the man, to the will of the group. It was never like that. I couldn't do it. I didn't have the constitution for a lot of my life to do that. And it's harmed me. It is time and time again. It is in practical, real terms, significantly reduced my opportunities and harmed me in many ways. So I think a lot of this sort of complete inability to recognize realities that exist outside of normie ideology. I think a lot of it comes down to this sort of conformity for the sake of social, not convenience, but something similar to that. Not social convenience, but just for the sake of maintaining good social relations with most people, basically, is what it comes down to not having the incorrect opinions and thus being ejected, banished from the tribe.
Yeah, and I think that actually dovetails fairly well with, pardon me, the general inability to connect to this other dimension. Because an intelligent normie isn't not going to pick up on certain problems in the world, let's put it that way. But what his mind seems to do is to recategorize certain problems as anomalous, whereas you and I might look around and just see this consistent pattern that people aren't doing well and they're fairly miserable. they would kind of look at those maybe as isolated pocket incidents, but not ascribe any sort of consistency to them, and probably not order them as a kind of sequence of events or something that's interrelated. They would just say, oh, well, Bob there, he's having a bad time. But that's not descriptive of the greater reality I inhabit, right? I think
Yeah,
that's
I
what's
don't.
happening, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know if you view it this way, but my perception is, and what seems to be a tendency in my experience, in my personal observations, is that normal people or normies, whatever term you want to use, normies very often don't think of things in trends or tendencies.
Yeah.
They they very much treat they very much treat everything as an individual case that has some mysterious mysterious, magical, vague, amorphous explanation or cause, but it's often the same causes that they attribute to problems.
No.
Um, but at the same time, they don't extrapolate that onto broader trends. I don't know if you're getting what I'm saying.
No, I do. I do. Yeah. But it's kind of was my point. Like I said, they see Bob. Bob's got this particular problem, and I don't know. Maybe his mother divorced his father, and she's an alcoholic, and it creates this chain reaction. But that's not reflective of say, a general trend in marital dysfunction, as an example, right? It's just sort of that's just Bob and his mother, and that's kind of it. Um, rather than looking at the bigger picture and say, well, actually, this isn't too uncommon, and this sort of thing. But I mean, I guess it just comes down to mental architecture ultimately. I remember even in my earliest days, I would be quote unquote characterized as a kind of misogynist. I mean, I don't think I am one, but people can debate about that. But just
And this
for
was before you had started really shoring up and hashing out your
yeah,
current view, far before that.
we're talking literally the late 90s here. So, well, when some people were wearing nappies and or diapers, depending on your variant of English, yes. No offense to those who were, but nothing wrong with wearing nappies and diapers
I,
as a baby, by the way.
yeah, I was one of those people. Or if
Right,
you're talking about the mid '90s, I didn't even exist then. So yeah,
right. So back then, where I would just notice the weirdest, screwiest behavior on the part of women, and I would kind of call it out. I'd be in a group of people, say, oh, that's really odd that, I don't know, Sally is doing this. And you could kind of get this strange acknowledgement on the part of men. It's sort of, they kind of, there's kind of a glint in their eyes, and you'd think, oh, they kind of get it, but they're not going to speak up. And so even in my earliest days, I was kind of known in the circles I ran in as somebody who had quote unquote extreme views or views that didn't conform, particularly with respect to men and women, and the fact that, just to be perfectly honest, women got away with so much more in terms of their behavior. Back then was no exception, 25, 20 years ago. And I realized that at the time, looking back on it, that glint of acknowledgement, the hint it never really went past that. And so maybe from the get-go, there was just something fundamentally distinct about my own mental architecture. And I'm hardly singing my own praises. For all I know, I would have been better off as a normie. That I simply couldn't accept. I couldn't accept this constant asymmetry I observed, just say in basic human treatment. Women at the time, they would just get a better deal. I remember having to take, for example, an obligatory science lab class, and you'd think my background was not in the the hard sciences by any means, but nonetheless, I had to do a chemistry lab project, right? And I know for a fact that the girls were just, there were several of them, I think three, if I recall. They basically were getting it done for them by some, willing simp or guy or whatever. And this behavior existed back then too. And I observed these things, and I pointed out, and nobody really took to it. And I observed this really for being a teenager without the internet, going forward, long before Thinking-Ape was around. But And for some reason, it just never really resonated with other people, but I felt the need to point it out nonetheless. I said, well, this is eminently observable. I need to just say this because it's true, right? So I think there might be just something about particular psychologies, mine, yours, whatever, that differentiates other people. I mean, most men, for example, will acknowledge that dealing with women on average is a bit of a pain in the butt. I'm being a bit euphemistic here, but yeah, it's not easy, right? Particular in the context of a relationship. It's not easy. But they'll rarely try to get to the bedrock of it all and really understand from top to bottom what's going on. They just sort of accept it as something and don't and do some hand waving and just it's kind of almost mystical, right? Women are just they're complex or they're difficult. I think, yeah, there must be some, yes, the social conformity part, but I also think that some people just can't resist going the extra mile to understand these things. I'm not saying I'm special, but I definitely was one of these people just way back in the day. I remember this was a little over 20 years ago. A former friend of mine at the time was engaged with this girl, and I was just calling. I had met her a few times, and I just knew she was going to break it off because hypergamy floats and all that. A couple of years later, I called it, and I told him the whole time, I'm sorry, but I don't trust her. I think what happened, she ended up, dumping him and shacking up with some wealthier, blah, 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 blah. And even when I was in a position to say, I told you so, people still didn't acknowledge what appeared to be fortune telling. It wasn't really. I just kind of observed this pattern even back then. So, yeah, and I've heard actually normie folk tell me, normie men, they'll say, well, Thinking-Ape, even if that's true, I wouldn't want to adopt that because it would be, damaging to my interactions with women, which is kind of goes along with the social conformity thing. So preferably, leave it mysterious, keep it whatever. Don't understand it. Um, but yeah,
If
it's
you lift up the log or the rock to look underneath, you might find a lot of bugs.
yeah. But the log or the rock itself might have some interesting patterns brought about by millions of years of erosion or something. So it's not nicer to look at that. Yeah, yeah, something like that. And it does seem to be some people just I'm more susceptible to just going down rabbit holes. And a lot of people don't know this. I'm known, as Thinking-Ape, but I mean, my first interest as a child was zoology. I wanted to understand animal behavior, why they were doing things. You look at this as an extension of that, I guess. But a lot of people just, I guess, it just stops at a certain point, and I find that impossible to connect on. But I think the worst thing that comes of it is going back to that original point when they kind of use that against you. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons to be depressed. In my case, chronic sleep deprivation doesn't help. But I'd assume even if I slept very well, even though that would improve things immensely, I suspect, at least in terms of my productivity and activity, I don't think I would fundamentally start believing that things are basically okay in the world, right? That seems obviously to be a turnoff, but it's also something that they, in general, use as a tool, right? I'm often chastised, chided for, well, I'll say hello or greet people, and they'll say, well, you can hear the cynicism and depression in your voice. I've heard that actually.
I mean, I've gotten things like that a lot as well, even though when I'm talking, it feels like I have a lot of inflection in my voice, but other people have told me similar things for a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I mean, what I think is another potential cause or another thing that differentiates sort of normal people that seem to have this massive barrier in place, this invisible wall that they slam into where you can see them kind of recognizing that there's some tendency, some trend, some pattern, that there's some awareness that there's some pattern, but they just won't go any further. Um, Another explanation, it's not extremely interesting, I think, but it is another explanation, is just simply that, in my view, one of the most common impetuses to any kind of consideration or reflection or introspection or contemplating a problem, whether externally or internally, whether it's something physical or it's something mechanical, it's a car breaking down. I think most of the time the impetus to consideration and contemplation is failure. I
Yeah.
think a lot of the time, I think that's the most common cause for contemplation and consideration is failure.
Mm.
Most people don't think about how their car works until it breaks down. Most people don't think about how their body replicates cells, how cell division works until they get cancer, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's fairly easily explained in some cases just by simply some people have not had enough failures or enough major failures. I mean, there's nobody who lives a perfect life without any kind of difficulty or any kind of suffering or any kind
Hmm.
of whatever. There's nobody like that, but there's certainly degrees of it. It varies. I mean, anybody could tell you that. Um, I think there are just some people for whom there just hasn't been enough failures or enough major failures or enough failures of a certain kind or type, enough repetition for them to start asking themselves the question, is there, what's going on here? What's the issue? You know, how do I fix it? Um, I think for a lot of cases that's the underlying cause, the thing that differentiates. Um, it's really silly to say. I wish I could think of a different way to phrase it, but people like us,
Mm.
that's not necessarily a positive thing. Like I said, it's the way I am has made my life pretty pretty difficult. But I think that is a major thing that differentiates people like us and normal people, is that, at least in my case, I think I just had a lot of failures at an early age, and they started compounding, and it started becoming this feedback loop. And then I started to think a lot about how social relations work, how interpersonal relations work, how people think, how people form their personalities, what makes people the way they are. I started to consider that a lot around the time I was between the ages of. I really started around the between the ages of 9 to 12. I started reading biographies and I started reading Wikipedia articles around that time, and I started really thinking about it a lot just because I'd seen massive interpersonal failures in my own family and personal life, and I was alone a lot, um, and it was just lots of failure over and over and over again. I don't know how. I don't think that's particularly a common experience, right? So I think that, at least in my case, failure was very significant in forming the way I think about things,
Mm.
and the way I'll consider trends and patterns. And maybe that's not terribly common, and maybe that explains a lot of the difference, a lot of that other dimensionalness that you feel, that you perceive, which I mean, I feel it too. I mean, just normal people, it really does feel like they live in another dimension from me on some very fundamental level. It's
I
hard to put
mean,
into words, really.
mhm. I get it. I mean, my life is, I'd like to think, at least even in the most technical sense, not been exclusively checkered by failure. I mean, by any sort of normative standard, I have a bachelor's degree, two master's degrees. I mean, that some people would say that's nothing. But it's not really exactly failure. I've done something, right? I worked in the translation industry for a while. Yeah, is
Yeah, I wasn't speaking. I mean, I
yeah.
might have unintentionally made it sound like I was speaking for you, but
No, no,
I wasn't.
but some things have been. I mean, you look at my kind of involuntary failure to sleep, right? I mean, it's a failure in itself. It's not a failure I've caused really, by any, at least not knowingly. But sure, I mean, this is something for me that always just it's so difficult to explain to normies or sleep normies because the connection between, not sleeping well for decades and seemingly being in a bad mood or not being at your best or being irritable or whatever it might be, right? So I think my worst failures really are the sort of the, well, in this case, sort of health failures. But nonetheless, if there's anything that's been truly illustrative in my life in demonstrating to me just how one thing, if it's sufficiently important, can really weed you out from pretty much everyone else, it's been this. Sometimes I watch the Lord of Ireland, IK, the Scion of Dodge's videos, and it's presumably late at night, and he's chugging Dunkin' Donut coffees one after the other, and apparently with no sleeping issues. So I bring that up if only because certain things become unrelatable, and then you begin. For me, it was kind of holistic. So, well, if I'm failing on the account of my sleep in terms of my health in this regard, and it affects everything I do, from my YouTube output to any other work I do to can I walk an extra half an hour a day? Do I walk an extra 2 flights of stairs? Whatever, for exercise during the pestilence days, since I can't go to the gym. That has a holistic effect for me in the sense that it makes me more capable of understanding other sources of failure, even if they're not identical. So I can, our common acquaintance with, I think, cerebral palsy he has, yeah, right?
Yeah,
Um,
cerebral palsy, and
mhm.
he's short as well. He's below 5'8".
and and
He's
and
5'6" or 5'4".
and unattractive, yeah. So I can easily hopscotch from my own personal health issue, which has ruined my life, to that and say, well, that's going to be a huge impetus. So I think it can be certainly, yeah, failure, and that's what I mean. So there is a connection there. I mean, who knows? Maybe if I had been sleeping better, I would have been able to fully pursue a PhD. One of my reasons for never going for a PhD was in part, not entirely, health concerns, right, and what have you. So I can hopscotch from my problem to any number of other problems, even if I don't have them, and very easily envisage how deleterious and devastating and destructive they can be to a certain individual. And I think, well, in a sense, you're definitely right. It could be cumulative failures that you might have mentioned, perhaps in your own case. I'm not saying it was the case, but perhaps in your case, or one or two very large failures, even if it's a failure of health, that completely recast reality for you, such that other types of failures have become more accessible, right? Be it the failure of choosing the wrong parents in terms of looks, or not being born smart enough, or being too short, or just having horrible luck
All
in your,
failure,
no,
all failures of choosing the wrong parents, just in
mm,
different
yeah.
arenas, but all of them come from choosing the wrong
Or
parents. Yeah.
even ones that don't. You have the misfortune of some drunk driver driving on a sidewalk, he runs you over and you're paraplegic, shit like that.
I
Yeah.
mean, something like that happened in my, family
Mm,
background.
mm,
Somebody got into a car accident. A guy that was high on cocaine caused them to lose their severe, spine issues, caused them to lose their job. That happened to my family. So yeah.
yeah. So maybe the key to understanding the normie is, I don't want to say that normies don't face adversity, because they seemingly, for example, maybe a normie has a beloved relative that is suffering from some terminal cancer. I mean, but they just perceive it differently. I'm not
Yeah,
really,
I mean,
yeah.
we're getting to some of the more interesting meat of this, I think,
Mm,
because obviously we have too much personal experience seeing. It's not as though every single person we've ever met that's had something bad happen to them is some non-normie, non-conformist
yeah,
with,
yeah, obviously.
views of the world that contrast and conflict with mainstream acceptable establishment views. It's not the case. I've definitely encountered people who very much have a normie mentality, a normie view of the world, and have had bad things happen to them, right? Um, so, people that are simply have this barrier up to any consideration of anything outside of a sort of normal mainstream worldview, because for the sake of social conformity,
Mm.
in order to benefit their own social standing, that's not interesting, right? Um, People that simply haven't had enough adversity or enough difficulty or enough failures or significant enough failures, the same kinds of failures over and over again, that's not extremely interesting either. I think that's a little more interesting. What is interesting
Mm.
are the people who have experienced these sorts of things, have experienced repeated failures, difficulty, adversity, suffering, and yet they still very much have this mentality very strongly. I think that's definitely that interests me at least. Yeah.
It interests me too, and it seems to come down just to sort of neural architecture. Um, I've known people throughout my life who occasionally have experienced terrible suffering, but they still, at least nominally, project this, always look at the bright side of life, and they don't, I guess, succumb to the despair as perhaps we have done. So, and I guess you could call it psychological wherewithal or something like that. Uh, but
I mean, that's definitely the case, but that's the general cause. That's the general vague in broad strokes
yeah,
reason. I mean, it's kind of like saying it's not quite the same. This isn't quite analogous, but it's kind of like saying if somebody says, "Why did Ted Bundy kill people? He was a bad man."
all right,
Per, so, X person did Y bad, did Y thing because they were good or bad or anything like. That's never been an explanation for any behavior or anything ever, right? Or something like, I mean, I've even heard it go as extreme as when people are describing other people's behavior, the most extreme form of this I've heard and the least descriptive, right, is, well, he just chose to be lazy. Uh,
all right,
he made the wrong choice. He chose to do a bunch of drugs and overdose.
mm,
He chose to be bad. He chose to be wrong. He chose
right.
to. That's the most extreme form of it. And when you actually stop and think about that, what does that describe? What does that tell you about the causes of the behavior? How is that? In what way is that descriptive or of the causes of the behavior that you're observing? It doesn't tell you anything about the causes,
Well,
right?
in part because these things are going to be multifactorial and very complicated. So why a particular individual who experiences great suffering doesn't succumb to the quote-unquote black pill view, genes will play some part of it, obviously. There will be some environmental factor. And again, the weeds about it would be pretty difficult, right? Because we'd have to know
Neither of
pretty
us are
much.
geneticists.
We're not
Neither of
geneticists, we're
us
not
are.
psychologists, we're not researchers.
We're
And
not
in,
here discussing one single particular individual
yeah,
case. We're not discussing in depth with lots of data and lots of
I mean,
knowledge our mutual 5'4" cerebral palsy acquaintance, though I think he's might be an interesting
well, in a
case. I
sense
don't
he
know.
is because he goes to work, he tries to do his best, right? He kind of, as far, I haven't interacted too much with him, but seems to just accept his fate as such. His own siblings treat him like trash, but he just sort of, I guess he just accepts it, right? I mean, he doesn't completely fall to despair. At least that's my impression. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, he's different from me in that respect, where I've not been as unlucky as him in certain ways. I mean,
Mm,
I don't have cerebral palsy, and I'm 6 foot.
mm.
Um, so I mean, I haven't been as unlucky, but I've certainly given up far more than it seems he ever has. So yeah, it's admirable. Maybe futile, but admirable. Uh, that I mean, that is a good question asked, but yeah, unfortunately, I just don't know enough about his life. I mean, we can say that it just comes down to genetic factors, and that's going to, like you said, play a role. But
But even in that case, if you were to take that case apart, again, his own sister besmirches him and is extremely
yeah, his
disrespectful to him.
sister's his sister's a real piece of work, a true normie. Yeah,
Yeah. So it's just, I think to get a truly holistic understanding of any of this, you would probably need the training. Maybe you'd be a geneticist, behavioral geneticist, maybe some kind of researcher. Then you'd have to really start from the very beginning of a person's life, know what you could know about the person's genome. Other than that, it's partly the reason why people say, oh, why did this guy kill this guy? Well, he was a bad guy. Or why did this guy not lose weight? It's because he chose to be lazy. Sure. It's just very, very difficult. And I mean, we're always working with limited data. And I think in a lot of ways, these dismissive gestures people offer are shorthand for that. I mean, people don't have the time to look into it. So in the case of this guy, to get back to the original story, well, Thinking-Ape is just depressed, so I don't need to listen to anything he has to say. It's just easier to work within those parameters and give very little information as a descriptor for whatever than it is to really get into the weeds about these things and look into the details as to why some people are more resilient than others. And I think about my own family members, and I see just wild contrast. Some people that are just have been immiserated their whole lives, and other people have suffered a great deal and are still, all things considered, reasonably positive, for lack of a better word. And it is pretty mysterious. But I think one point I'd like to drive home is that as inaccessible as the normies are, I know that you and I right now are expending far more energy trying to understand the dynamics between us and them than they ever do in return. I don't think they spend, those weird, quote unquote black pill depressive folk. They don't really, why are they the way they are? I mean, they might have some narrative they tell themselves, really basic stuff, and like, oh, they're just depressed. Well, okay, well, if they are depressed, why are they depressed? Or, but I don't think they spend nearly as much energy, in part because they're in the majority. Neurotypical people, is it neurotypical? Yeah, I guess neurotypical people are in the majority in this regard. So it's a lot easier to just dismiss it out of hand. Whereas we're sort of scratching our heads trying to really figure out why is it that this portal to the normie dimension is so inaccessible. But to sort of
I
tie,
mean, if I can just jump
sure,
in
sure, sure,
for a
sure, yeah.
second. So I think that circles back around again to the mere fact that our way of thinking and our way of viewing the world is a minority view, and it's
Mm,
socially unacceptable. And it in raw practical terms, if it's working for you, if the way people interact and the establishment of views and all of that, if everything is just sort of working for you, why would you consider what essentially, in your view, a loser? I mean, to the extent they do refer to us, yeah, it seems it's typically with some sort of epithet. If you or derogatory term, if you disagree with the general consensus view on anything, it's usually that you're referred to using some sort of epithet or derogatory term.
no.
And in raw practical terms, how would they actually benefit from really considering it? Because again, in the case of that guy that you talked with, that smart STEM guy or whatever he was, I think he was STEM, right?
Yep.
If he's socially successful enough and his life is going good and he's accepted by groups of normal people and he has opportunities, he has economic career opportunities, he has social opportunities. Why would he jeopardize that by opening himself up to a chance to being convinced of an idea that would make him more socially unacceptable for holding? I think that really is a massive part of it.
Yeah, yeah, without question. But I think sometimes what concerns me is I still sort of nominally need to get along with these people, and I
We
find my
have to. They don't have to get along with us, but we have to get along with them because we're in the minority, but they're in the majority, right?
right,
It's that sort of asymmetry.
right, and so I'm a bit of a bind because on the one hand I kind of sometimes need to get along with them, but it sometimes is a very uncomfortable thing, right? It's sort of the very definition of, just be yourself, bro. Well, no, I really can't be myself in your presence, Mr. Normie or Mrs. Normie. So I'm going to be holding back. I'm going to be putting on airs. I'm going to be doing, take your pick. And
I remember that one time we were in the conversation with a couple of people, and it was we were I guess we were trying to convince them of uh, of gender, of sex dynamics, of
mm,
male female dynamics, and sexual marketplace dynamics, our
yeah,
view of it, and hypergamy, and all that stuff. We were trying to convince them of these sorts of views, and they were saying something along the lines of course, they had very normie views. And it came down at some point, somehow we got to this point where we were using as an example some guy that is very content working at McDonald's.
ah,
Um, some guy that's very content working at
I
McDonald's,
remember.
flipping burgers. And what we were putting to them was, well, okay, because their position was that uh, income doesn't matter, career doesn't matter, resources don't matter. All of these superficial qualities and characteristics
Mm,
don't matter all that much in terms of attraction
mm,
in the sexual marketplace. It's more vague, amorphous, personality-based things like drive or something like
right.
that. And then, we brought up the example of the burger flipper. Well, I mean, what about the burger flipper who feels his life's calling is to flip burgers and he has the drive to flip burgers? And they just wouldn't accept that example, even though there's probably somebody out there like that actually exists, but they couldn't tell us why it was that, it's unacceptable for some person to, there was this cognitive dissonance they seemed to be experiencing, right? Because their position was that, superficial things like income don't matter, status don't matter. These things don't matter, yet for some reason it's unacceptable for some random guy for his goal to be a burger flipper. That's indicative of some sort of, it's not the fact that he's a burger flipper and that's low status and low income. That's not why it's unacceptable. That's not why he'd be unattractive to people. He'd be unattractive to people because your life's goal being a burger flipper, that indicates that there's something seriously wrong with you, or that there's some lack of drive or some lack of desiring something more of yourself. So they were basically just acceding to our argument, basically.
Mm,
They were basically just conceding to our argument. But they just couldn't fully consciously acknowledge that fact. It's that sort of other dimensionally. They're almost there, but not quite, and they have to twist it around to try to make it. They have to twist themselves in knots, trying to make what they can make the contradictions fit, acceptable mainstream normie ideas and models of how things work.
yeah, I recall that vividly. Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, a bit of a tangent.
Well, yeah, I think
Apologies.
that exactly that it'll all just sort of conform to, burger flipper isn't ambitious, doesn't represent status, but there's something wrong with him. It's not that he doesn't have status or he's not ambitious. It's just it was this weird kind of circular. He doesn't have enough drive, but what if he's content? Then if he's content, there's something wrong with him. It was a very
And th-
strange. Mm,
and this is the kind of reasoning that I've encountered so many times with normies, right? I think this is part of what we're talking about here. This sort of weird cognitive dissonance, circular reasoning, equivocation, right? I mean, there's equivocation going on there. They were basically referring to status, but the reason why they're criticizing this hypothetical passionate burger flipper was because they couldn't tell us how it was problematic without it just being because being a burger flipper is low status and low income. They couldn't tell us why that indicated there was something wrong for any reason other than, it's low status and it's low income. But they couldn't say that, so they equivocated. They were essentially describing status in that he should be striving for higher status. That's what they were implying, but they weren't using the term status. So I mean, it's very, very common. This sort of weird double thing, this weird sort of cognitive dissonance, this weird sort of equivocation. And so many times, and so many of my interactions with normies have been exactly like that conversation we had.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is why we sort of need to figure out a way to quote unquote conform to their world. I mean, I can do it to a limited degree, but there sometimes when it comes to brass tacks, certain topics are unavoidable, and I don't know what to do. I guess I can hold my tongue in such moments, but hmm, that's all I can really do. And the problem as well is that if you want to quote unquote succeed or deal with normal people, then you're going to have to hold your tongue. You're going to have to at least pretend. I guess I can pretend reasonably well up to a degree, but I'm not sure how effective that would be over a longer period of time of interacting with people. I mean, sure, I've had this discussion with many people. You know, if your hobby is sort of model trains, which is, I guess, an odd hobby these days, or putting together Japanese toy robots, you might never get around to talking about, I don't know, sexual dynamics or anything else that might be controversial. But there's always some risk just because of human dynamics, human topics of discussion. Maybe you're hanging out with
Conversations are dynamic. They're meandering
yeah, yeah,
topics, shift and change, and they drift.
precisely. So you end up in a situation where you're at a dinner or a lunch table and you're hanging out with Bob, John, Sally, and Jane, and Sally and Jane, of course, the have the advantage in the conversation because they're female, and they start complaining about, I don't know, their boyfriends or and the whole story sounds crooked and odd. And I've been in situations like this, by the way,
I
where
have too.
I've actually been in a restaurant on a few occasions where I'm just listening to a bunch of normal, quote unquote, normie females, and I just think nothing in this story really makes sense. And to the extent it does, I'm sure not everything is being revealed. But I had to hold my tongue, and I would just
It
nod,
is.
raise a
Yeah,
glass of
sorry.
water, and sip on the water and suck on the ice cubes, and just hope that it would be over soon.
Yeah, it is very, very, very easy to out yourself as a heretic, which is essentially what, I mean, it's a goofy way of putting it, but that is essentially what you and I are, and what I imagine the majority of people listening to this are heretics, right? And it's very, very easy to out yourself as a heretic. Normal people are going to constantly give you opportunities and prompt you to out yourself as a heretic all the time. Because like in that instance that you just relayed, those women, they were talking, they're putting forth probably strong opinions, right? Some pretty strong opinions, but they were the right ones. They were the socially acceptable ones, so they weren't going to get penalized for expressing them. But there's certainly things that you could very easily disagree with, views and opinions and statements you could very easily disagree with and are not necessarily true, but they're the mainstream establishment view, so they are automatically accepted. Um, And yeah, I mean, it just anytime you're interacting with people, there's just all these. Unless you're in a small group of friends, who are also heretics, but most of the time you don't have the luxury of that. There's conversation and social interactions are just this landmine of instances where you could accidentally out yourself as a person who has the wrong thoughts and views things the wrong way. I mean, back before COVID really hit, I was socializing a lot more, and I was constantly wearing the mask. nobody, as far as I could tell, had even the slightest inkling that I have a lot of views on people and the world that are considered pretty socially unacceptable. As far as I could tell, absolutely nobody had even the slightest inkling. Um,
Mm.
I was, I was social. I was in a group of people. I had a social group where I was with them for a couple of years, and it was a club, and eventually, when the founder of the club left, um, he had me take over management, setting up events, things like that, organizing. Obviously, I don't think he would have done. And the guy had, when I went to his apartment, I would go out to his apartment to hang with him, and he had leftist memorabilia and posters and stuff on the stick. Like he had refrigerator magnets that were BLM and stuff like that, and LGBTQ. Um, and that sort of thing. So obviously, if he had any inkling that, for instance, I think that men and women are not the same. If he had any inkling of that, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have handed the reins over to me, but he did. And the whole point of all that is just that, I think most of us have to put on that mask. I think most of us don't have the luxury of most of the time not having to have the mask on.
No.
It's just something you have to deal with when you have the wrong ideas.
Yeah. 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 It's just that I think, I mean, thankfully, the internet does exist, and so you can catch some relief by, yeah, hanging out and talking to your fellow heretics occasionally. There needs to be some breathing room, right? And eventually, it's just talking to normies, it's a bit much, right? Especially if it's any as conversation, as you point out, conversations meander and they end up turning into different things. If you're not just talking about food and the weather, then you just
Eventually, sooner or
realize,
later, it's gonna venture into risky territory where you could out yourself. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think though we have hopefully done a decent job at trying to figure out why the portal to the other dimension of normies is so inaccessible. But I think we did come to the conclusion that to really understand that you would have to study individual cases in excruciating detail and look into why, family history, genes, life events. It would be quite the undertaking, um, unfortunately. And so,
Yeah. At the very least, one major cause is the more boring one of people don't even open themselves up to ideas that could potentially make it more difficult for them to conform to mainstream society. That's
yeah,
a pretty simple one.
I'd say so. Yeah, as well as sort of something you've pointed out many times. I agree with that. If you've never really experienced certain problems, obviously this isn't universally true as we sort of dissected a bit, but then certain things won't appear to be problems, right? Not everyone can leapfrog from one problem to others and sort of extrapolate beyond that. But yeah, I think that we have done as decent a job as we could at covering this topic, unless we've left something out, which we probably have. But I do think if you're a heretic, and probably are if you're watching this, then yeah, thank the gods for the internet, a brief respite in face of all the conformity that's required.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, one last
Mm,
note to end on, I guess, is I think the most interesting people of all are the people that have all of the tools to be. There's very, very few of these people, and I've met maybe one, and we both. I think you might already know who I'm referring to.
mm,
People who have already been handed the keys to the kingdom, who have been given all the tools to succeed, not just succeed, but pass with flying colors in normie land, yet still somehow have developed interest in ideas and models of reality and social relations that are not the acceptable ones, the good ones, the
mm,
ones that the morally upright people have.
mm,
Our mutual acquaintance, the the Chad
Oh yeah.
that subscribes to lookism, basically,
Hmm. Yeah.
and other things as well. Those might be the most interesting people because they don't. The whole thing of failure being the impetus to reflection doesn't apply to them, right?
Right.
That's not an explanation because they were given they were given what they needed to succeed.
Yeah.
And they do succeed, but yet for some reason they still consider it, and that might be genuine curiosity, which might be a rarer thing than people realize. Um, I think those are probably the most interesting cases. Yeah.
I'd agree. It's a shame that we'll likely never speak to our acquaintance, the Chad who knows, as we shall refer to him. But, you know, as always, everyone, thank you for tuning in. I hope the conversation was entertaining if it wasn't enlightening.